Welcome to WebRTC Live. In WebRTC Live, we cover the latest technical topics and business use cases for WebRTC and live video. As always, this episode is brought to you by WebRTC.Ventures, leading integrators of WebRTC video into your custom application.
Welcome back to WebRTC Live. I'm your host, Aaron Syme, founder and CEO of WebRTC.Ventures. WebRTC.Ventures is a custom design and development agency focused on building live video applications, here to help you take your app live. You can learn more about us at WebRTC.Ventures. Thanks for joining us live today on YouTube, LinkedIn, and Twitch, and welcome also to any of you watching a replay of today's event. For those of you with us live, you can ask questions throughout the stream by leaving a comment in whichever platform you're viewing this. For today's episode, Dan Jenkins is joining us to talk about the future of broadcasting with WebRTC. Dan is founder of Broadcaster VC, as well as founder of communications app consultancy Nimble Ape, a well-known leader in the WebRTC and VoIP application development space. Thanks for joining me today, Dan.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure to have you here. For those of you watching live, we had a slight delay in going live today because apparently I didn't hit the go live button properly. So hooray for live events. But in any case, we are live now. And Dan, you and I were starting talking, and I'll have to ask to repeat a little bit of the conversation because I think we were getting to some interesting stuff there about some of the events that you and I have been to lately. I was at TAD Summit. I'm headed to the AWS reInvent soon. And you were talking about a couple events that you've been to in the US. Tell us about those and kind of what it's been like getting back to conference travel.
Yeah, so the first event I went to was Demuxed in San Francisco. New event for me and new kind of industry for me as well. So Demuxed is more targeted at typical video, typical live streaming type developers and businesses. And then from San Francisco, we headed over to Chicago to go to ClueCon. ClueCon is a event around FreeSwitch, one of the open source VoIP platforms. And both of them were great fun, exhausting, but great fun all at the same time. Yeah, being around people in real life for 10 days was a lot. But on the other side of it, it was very rewarding and got to meet a lot of people that I hadn't met in person or at least I haven't seen in 3 years. So it was absolutely fantastic. And I loved being in the US again.
Nice. Well, yeah, it is great to get back to some of these events and tell a little bit about what's the connection between WebRTC and in Demuxed. You were talking about the OTT kind of industry and their increased interest in WebRTC. What are they looking to use WebRTC for?
So historically, there's always been this love-hate relationship between WebRTC, the technology, and these developers, these people building stuff on top of HLS or Dart or whatever. It's a tough one because ultimately they want a nice standard to be able to work against, and WebRTC has lots of standards, right? In the IATF, in the W3C, and this was actually part of my talk at Demuxed. My talk at Demuxed was called WebRTC Still Sucks, and I found it quite a hilarious talk. I think it gets released publicly in December, so hopefully lots of people will agree with me. But yes, there's lots of problems with WebRTC that we as kind of web developers or native app developers kind of just, work around because we build our own signaling layers or we use SIP over WebSocket for VoIP stuff or whatever. And that crowd, the Demuxed crowd, like greater control over their media, than say WebRTC allows. And then also they like nice standards for ingest or egress or whatever. And so with WIP and WEP on the way, this is where I forget what they're called. The WebRTC HTTP ingress protocol, and WEP is the WebRTC HTTP egress protocol, I think. So with those on the way, we're now starting to see hardware encoders and decoders actually like allow support for WIP and for WEP, and so it means that an integration is actually going to work across multiple platforms, right? And you don't have to implement, I don't know, Wowzer's API or whoever, or Amazon's API. It's going to work for everyone. So yeah, no, it's an interesting crowd, and it's an interesting industry when it comes to WebRTC and how it's starting to get used within air quote broadcast. It has been used extensively, especially through the pandemic in broadcast. But whether or not that was because they wanted to or not is debatable.
Absolutely. So what are you working on in broadcasting right now?
So Broadcaster VC is our new thing. It's now probably about 2 years old, really, from its inception. From the first idea, it's probably about 3 years old. We built it a year. No. So back to the very beginning of the story. CommCon Virtual, the very, very first one, just as the pandemic was kind of ramping up, at least in Europe. And so we couldn't put an in-person conference on. Right. And so we kind of shifted absolutely everything to virtual. And it was a terrible experience from a recording perspective. And we use vMix, and vMix's WebRTC stuff wasn't great back then. It's improved since, but back then, like you couldn't even select the audio and video device you wanted in the page. They had no, like, the very, very basics of what you need. They didn't have. And so a couple of us stupidly said, "Oh, we can do better than this." And then kind of mold it over. And then a year later, we started building Broadcaster VC. So Broadcaster VC is very much targeted at ingest into professional AV workflows that already exist. So imagine having a panel of people, like 3 or 4 people on a panel. And in real-time communication world, we would just be used to the fact that I can talk to you and I can talk to this other person, and it all be pretty much real time, like, I don't know, 20 to 50 milliseconds, maybe a little bit more, right? Yeah. And so the human brain copes with that delay fine. You get a little bit here and there of over talking or whatever, but we cope with it very, very well. Well, as soon as we started talking about vMix being an MCU in the middle of that thing, in the middle of a panel, and it mixing things and doing mix minus on stuff, and it just wasn't a very good experience. And so, yeah, people would overtalk one another, and there'd be like half a second's worth of delay, and it was terrible. Now, I'm not bashing vMix. Things have improved a lot from vMix's side within the past couple of years. But Broadcaster VC is designed as an SFU-based WebRTC service, so that you get things in complete real time, and then they get given out as ISO feeds in whatever format an AV company or broadcaster wants to ingest that in, whether or not that's using NDI, whether or not that's using SDI out using AJA cards or Blackmagic cards or whatever. Basically, we are saying we will output in whatever format you want, because they've already got their workflows, right? They don't want to like start screen sharing stuff and recording a screen or whatever. That's just stupid. So instead, we allow real-time talent to come in and share as many screen shares as they want, that kind of stuff. And all of those feeds get individually sent as ISO feeds to vMix or OBS or whatever they're using within their professional workflow, even hardware mixes.
So just make sure I understand. So, for example, you and I could be talking to each other as a remote panel discussion over WebRTC, and Broadcaster is going to put that out as an NDI feed that then my OBS setup can pick up locally.
Yeah, Broadcaster, think of Broadcaster not as, so we're currently on StreamYard, right? And I'm using StreamYard to bring in two people and create an output, and that output gets sent to Twitch and YouTube and whatever else.
Right.
Broadcaster is not that. Broadcaster is kind of just media delivery, right? So yes, we talk to one another, and then all of those feeds that you want to come out and go and get output in NDI, SDI, or whatever. They get read into a mixing software, and then that software then outputs it. It's more how, it's ultimately more how AV companies and broadcasters work. They don't use tools such as StreamYard or whatever, what StreamYard competitors out there,
sure,
to pre-composite everything within a web page. They want ISO feeds straight into whatever they use internally.
Yeah. No, I think it's an interesting example of how the I would say the WebRTC marketplace or the various industries that are interested in WebRTC have matured, particularly with the pandemic. In that, you could think about a tool like StreamYard that we're in now as being a perfectly good tool for a completely remote type of scenario, a completely web-based broadcast scenario like you and I are in right now. But that's great for people who are kind of working in that world, but the fact that a much more traditional industry with a lot of great technology and expertise in how to do their own event management and larger scale events and broadcasting are now looking at how they can incorporate WebRTC into that. That's what I mean by like a sign of maturity, right? Is that we're talking about WebRTC not just as something that you do for cool standalone prototypes or standalone projects, but something that really has to work and integrate within an ecosystem of many other things like NDI that have been around for a long time and tools like OBS.
Ultimately, WebRTC is available on something like 2 billion devices. I think it might be even more than that now. Basically, every single phone in someone's pocket is a WebRTC enabled phone.
Right.
Ignore the fact that like Safari does weird stuff or Chrome does weird stuff, and there's weird H.264 hardware encoders on Android or whatever. Ignore all of that stuff, because that's where developers like you and I shine. Like that's our job, right?
Right.
But as a batch of protocols, because it isn't one thing in itself, it's very, very powerful, right? And the fact that you could send a remote person that wants to join a news show as whatever, and you can just send them a link and it open up in whatever browser, whether or not it be Safari, whether or not it be Chrome that really is Safari, or whether or not it's Chrome on Android or whatever. It will just work. It's up to us to kind of work around all of the weirdness. And that's really, really annoying. And that's kind of what I was talking about in my WebRTC still sucks talk at Demux. But the fact is, you can send someone a link and you can get a media stream from their device, whether or not they're behind NAT, whether or not they're on IPv6 straight to a media server, whatever the network layer is, it doesn't matter. It just works. And you can't say that about anything else, right? You can't say like SRT is like very, very, very popular within the broadcast space at the moment. It's an open source protocol around sending media. But you can't say that 2 billion devices know how to talk SRT, because you have to download an app. You have to then like tell it where to send that media or whatever. Like it's not simple, right? Whereas absolutely every single tablet, phone, whatever, has a web browser on it, and it just works.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so you always have good session titles like "Why WebRTC Still Sucks," and another one that I think you did earlier this year gets to my next question, I believe, of how you are why I'm a control freak and you should be too, I believe was your session title. And I believe you were talking about the broadcaster architecture in that, right? So tell us a little bit about what you've learned about broadcasting in general, perhaps while working on broadcaster, as well as how has that changed and how has your architecture evolved over time?
Yeah, so that talk that I did at CommCon was called "I'm a control freak and you should be too," something along those lines. And yeah, it was basically driven from the journey that we've taken with Broadcaster VC. So at the very beginning, like the server side stuff hasn't really changed within Broadcaster VC at all, other than adding in SRT in support and WIP in support and making it easier to kind of ingress media. The server side stuff hasn't actually changed a lot. The key thing that did change was how we receive those streams and convert them over to NDI or over to SDI or whatever. And at the very, very beginning, we used a Docker image, and that Docker image contained a version of Janus with a licensable plugin from the Meet Echo team. And basically it takes WebRTC streams and makes it into NDI. And it's very, very good. If you are in an environment where you do not have end users and you are in control of that Janus server and you want NDI outputs, it is fantastic, absolutely fantastic. And the Meet Echo team helped tremendously get kind of Broadcaster off the line, right? But Docker images, like as soon as I said Docker images, anyone that knows Docker and Windows and Mac should have all recoiled in horror, because the underlying stuff with NDI is discoverable using MDNS, and again, MDNS with Docker on Mac, on Windows, everyone should be like with a cushion in front of their heads right now, because it doesn't work. Because the underlying Docker platform on Mac and Windows is a virtual machine, and it's got its own little NAT. And so MDNS doesn't really work outside of that local machine. And so you could run this Docker image that generated NDI all you wanted, and it works perfectly on Linux. But the one thing that I really learned was professional AV people do not like Linux. They like Windows. Yes, pretty much everyone went, how do I get this working on Windows? And so it was always you should just download a Linux VM and like assign a proper network interface to it, etc. And they'd be like, okay, it was tough. It was a hard sell. Like you'd show people a demo, and they'd go, "This is fantastic. This is exactly what we want. Like this is what we've been looking for ages." Blah 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 blah, and then they'd have to go and run it themselves, or like they'd get it running, but then they'd restart their machine, and things wouldn't kind of come back up the way that they would expect. Right. It was just painful. So yes, getting back to the story around being a control freak, we basically rewrote our client-side app away from using Janus to using Pion. So we receive our media using Pion. If you don't know what Pion is, where have you been? Pion is a fantastic WebRTC stack in its entirety, basically. Completely aside from libWebRTC, which is absolutely fantastic, is written in Golang, which means that we can create something that works natively on Mac, Windows, and Linux, right? And so we receive our media using Pion. We then push it into GStreamer to do all of our transcoding and like text overlays, things like that. And then we push it back out to Golang, which then outputs it via like NDI or outputs it via Blackmagic or whatever. And yeah, that is the talk, right? The talk was basically, we should all stop abusing these open source tools, because I was abusing Janus, right? Janus had this wonderful plugin, but Janus isn't designed to run on Windows, and it's not designed to run on Mac. But I was kind of forcing it to do stuff, or trying to force it to do stuff and failing. And it's the same with Asterisk. It's the same with FreeSwitch. We've got these great, powerful open source tools, and we've got a problem, and we push that problem into this thing, whether or not it's FreeSwitch, Asterisk, whatever, and it can solve 95% of our problem. And so we've still got 5%. And a lot of us kind of just go, well, that's kind of out of scope, and we're just not going to deal with that, or something along those lines. Or you end up spending a boatload of time writing a load of C and paying someone an extortionate amount of money to write C, right? Because there are very, very few C developers now. So basically, taking all of that, I said, well, what if you wanted to write a voicemail application in FreeSwitch? Or replace a voicemail application in FreeSwitch? Well, there's nothing stopping you writing that in Golang with Pion as an example, because Pion can do just pure RTP. And so there's absolutely no reason why you couldn't receive that media using Pion and then save it to disk using Golang. Like you write it as code, and you end up writing 100 lines worth of code, but it's all user test. It's all unit testable, and it's doing. You've got 100 lines of code, and you're deploying a small Go binary, versus having to kind of deal with this ginormous FreeSwitch installation that you're only using a small part of.
Right.
So the whole talk was around thinking about things differently, and maybe building small things with small projects is actually really quite good, and that we should maybe get away from kind of pushing this problem that we've got into this one size fits all,
Right?
Because that's ultimately what FreeSwitch and Janus and Co do. Janus is amazing, and if you watch the talk back, I sing high praises about Janus, because we still use Janus on the server side, and I can go through how our kind of orchestration layer all works in a minute. And we still use Janus heavily, and I love the Janus project, and I love the Meet Echo team, and it's the same with FreeSwitch. But we as an open source community kind of got into this really bad habit of like not creating small things anymore, and we kind of just like spin up this big instance of whatever and abuse it for years and years and years, whereas we should be trying to do better.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting point, and something that I feel like I see in the WebRTC ecosystem in general is that we do have a lot of very general purpose things, and every platform kind of tries to do everything to a degree, and I do think that's something that we're going to see more of is specialty applications, kind of like you're describing with Broadcaster. And that's one of the benefits of a library like Pion, being able to still leverage some of those general APIs, but in a more specific context for your particular use case. So,
yeah, I think probably the year 2023 is going to be the year where WebRTC Rust and Pion really kind of come alive. Not that they're not alive already; they're very, very much alive. But the fact that people can build small things that do very specific things is huge. I saw beginning of this week, I think, Sean from the Pion team tweeted out about an SRT to an SRT to WebRTC bridge that was written in Pion. And in the grand scheme of things, it's very, very, very small. Because it does one job well, right?
Right.
And that's what it's funny, isn't it? Like 5 years ago, 10 years ago, we were all talking about microservices and building one thing that did one thing well, right? And some people took that too far, and you then Elon is turning off microservices like crazy at Twitter and breaking two-factor auth in the process.
Right.
But we never really did that for media because it was difficult, right? Media is difficult. And no one's really like wanted to kind of get into the depths of media. And now these tools like Pion or Rust WebRTC or whatever, they're all kind of opening the doors for us to be able to do this kind of stuff ourselves.
Absolutely. So how let's talk a slightly different use case in WebRTC and broadcasting, and just get a little, because broadcaster of VC is about ingest, as you said, and bringing things in, and then that may be streamed out. The end product may be streamed out via HLS or whatever, right? For those who want to use WebRTC on the broadcasting side, on the egress side, what how just share a little bit of thoughts, advice on how you do that, and how large can you scale a WebRTC broadcast?
I mean, the short answer to that is to infinity and beyond, right? Because we've now got Dolby with the Millicast product. I'm not sure what they've rebranded Millicast to, or whether or not they even have rebranded it off the top of my head. It's now a Dolby product, whatever it's now called, and ultimately Millicast did exactly this. Allowed you to stream into Millicast using WebRTC, and then stream out to literally thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people viewing that feed. And with Cloudflare very, very recently announcing Cloudflare Stream in terms of WEP and no region and everything else, the limit is limitless pretty much, especially when you're using a platform as a service like Cloudflare or like Dolby. Now, if you wanted to go and do it yourself, it's really complicated. We know this. That you can only get so many media streams out of a box, right? Before it dies because of network congestion or CPU exhaustion or whatever. And so you have these underlying. If you want to keep everything WebRTC because you want super low latency, then you have Lorenzo from Meet Echo was actually talking about this very recently about SFU cascading. And basically you get this cascade of SFUs, and you get thousands upon thousands upon thousands connecting to one SFU to another SFU to another SFU. And yeah, ultimately, if you do it right, there is no limit. Now, whether or not you want to use WebRTC or whether or not it's just called is a good question. So CommCon Virtual last year, unfortunately, we didn't do one this year. I think time got away from us. But the one last year, we pushed everything into so both MUX and Millicast were sponsors. And so we pushed all of the video into Mux as well as Millicast, both at the same time. And then in the player, we had a switch that allowed you to switch between HLS. I think it was low latency HLS. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it allowed you to switch between HLS, WebRTC, and like WebRTC over Subspace's Turn network. Because again, Subspace were a sponsor. Subspace are no more, although I did read on LinkedIn that they said that they might be back in 2023. So that's quite an interesting side note within the WebRTC ecosystem. Now, we did it purely as a fun thing, right? Because like ultimately, if you're just watching a conference, do you really need it to be millisecond kind of deliverable? Not necessarily. But at the same time, you might go, but Dan, what if we want people to ask questions and you don't want them to be 6 seconds behind when they're asking the question, because then that's going to be like completely and utterly out of sync. Now the next question to ask them is, well, do you serve 99% of it via HLS because you don't care that it's 6 seconds delayed, 10 seconds delayed, right? For 99% of your audience. And then as soon as someone says, I want to join and ask a question, then you could then offer them a WebRTC stream. At which point you're not actually you're not broadcasting to thousands upon thousands of people using WebRTC. You're still broadcasting to thousands of people using HLS, right? But saying that, there is a big market around providing real-time sub-second slash millisecond media as a deliverable thing. Dolby buying Millicast is a great example of there's definitely an appetite for it, and there are definitely certain industries where you want it. So gambling, for example, you would definitely want sub-second latency for anything gambling related. But for average Joe conference, do you really need it? Or is it just a cool thing? But all of these things have a cost, and it's just figuring out what your cost matrix is and where the benefits are. But there is definitely a growing appetite for delivering these types of things over WebRTC. But then saying that, moving on to like a topic that I know we were going to talk about, there's also an appetite around using WebTransport and WebCodec,
right?
Because it gives underlying platforms, underlying developers more control over whatever their media is doing. Like you can then implement your own codec and do loads of fancy stuff, which is really, really interesting and really exciting. Don't get me wrong, I'm very excited about what we can do in the future with WebTransport and with WebCodec. My main kind of asterisk around it is really the fact that we've already got over 2 billion devices that can do WebRTC, right? Natively, like straight away. It's going to be 5, 6, 7 years really before WebTransport and WebCodec become a thing that is kind of mainstream enough to be able to go and use it. Like a lot of people at the beginning of WebRTC's journey said, Safari doesn't support it, so why are we doing it, right? We're in exactly the same position with WebTransport and WebCodec. If you don't know what WebTransport and WebCodec is, very, very quickly, it's basically so that you can have your own underlying transport mechanism so that you're not necessarily using SRTP, DTLS, etc. So you're in control of the transport layer, and then WebCodec allows you to then have your own codec as well, and basically do what Zoom were doing, 5 years ago, where they were essentially taking media from a browser, converting it into their own codec and then sending that media, air quote media, over the data channel instead of as a media stream. Zoom have been doing it a long time. And WebTransport and WebCodec were kind of built around that idea to give people more control in a standardized way.
Oh, yeah, I think I agree with everything you said about WebTransport and WebCodec. I do think it's very interesting where that will head over time. It's not really impacting the work that we do in the short term, and I don't expect it to, except in possible very, very unique use cases for now. Now, in terms of events and broadcasting where you do need sub-second latency, one that occurred to me is doing a hybrid panel discussion, which I personally encountered for the first time at TAD Summit when I was there and was on a hybrid panel, and it was really interesting. One little dynamic that I hadn't really thought about before, but I noticed as being part of that panel is there were a couple of us in person, and then there were 3 people remote in a video chat. And it was interesting because it was almost like the rapport between those who were remote was better than those of us who were in person. And there was a little bit of a wall there in between because of normal latency in conversation across continents, as well as just visual cues, right, of when someone wants to talk and that sort of thing. So these are situations where you can address some of that with how you do camera and microphone setups and stuff like that in an event, which I think is important in things maybe we didn't have to think about in the past. But there's also a tooling and a technology aspect there, and where sub-second latency is super important if you want to have that type of interactivity.
Yeah, absolutely. And like ultimately, like this is kind of where Broadcaster would shine, right? Like you've got remote people, you've got a camera that you can then ingest into the thing as a SRT feed or RTMP feed or whatever, or even a WebRTC feed from a camera back up as a room or whatever. This is kind of like why Broadcaster was kind of built in the first place, because doing stuff in real time with the tools that we had available to us was pretty bad. As event organizers, we all now have to think about how we put on events, and what we class as hybrid. And I know we're all going to fail hard the first time that we do it, because before the pandemic, we had in-person CommCons, for example, and we live streamed absolutely every single talk as it happened to YouTube. And so anyone that wasn't there was able to kind of still get involved because they could watch the video, air quote, live. It might be 10 seconds delayed, 30 seconds delayed or whatever. But they were live as far as live was back then, right? But there was no like interactivity between like the virtual world and the in-person world. It was a freebie. It was like, if you're not here, you can still watch the video, right? Now we've had virtual events, and now we're going to see less and less virtual events, I think, in the next year, and more hybrid events. The trouble is, hybrid isn't just a case of shoving a video stream to YouTube anymore, right?
Right, exactly.
and exactly as you found, like you've got some people virtually, some people in person. How do you merge those worlds in a good way that makes sense? It's going to be really challenging, to be perfectly honest with you. And it's a lot more effort, right? You can't just, you're not just worrying about, oh, is my event running properly in person? Is that table in the right place? Is that speaker lectern in the right place, right? You've now got to worry about this virtual world as well. And it's not just a case of like bringing in questions that get asked, right? You suddenly got to like make sure that the platform that you're doing everything on is working properly, and and make sure that there's no abuse and everything else, right?
Yeah.
It's going to be really challenging. And I think, unfortunately, we're going to see more and more events just go back to in person, which will be a shame, because we've all learned an awful lot over the past 3 years. And we've found that a lot of people's eyes have been open to the fact that people don't necessarily want to go back to in-person events for whatever reason, right?
Sure.
And so we don't want to exclude them from the community in itself as well. So the next year, 2 years around event organizing is actually going to be really quite challenging, I think, to get it right. And I think we're all going to fail hard the first time we do it. I'm expecting to fail hard the first time I do it. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see how many kind of just turn their back on the virtual space and just concentrate on in-person stuff, to air quote, get it right in person.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it would be a shame, because I think it's not just people who don't want to go to any events in person anymore. Those certainly and understandably, there are going to be people in that category, but people who just don't want to go to all the events or can't make it to all the events, just being able to participate in more things without having to get on an airplane every single time. That's nice.
People are more in tune with the environment and their carbon impact and everything else. So it's not just medical, it's not just COVID related, it's not just who's wearing a mask, who isn't wearing a mask. There are a ton of reasons that people don't necessarily want to go to an event, and we should be actively encouraging all of those participants in events as much as we possibly can, and running virtual events has shown that we can do it. We just need to figure out how to strike that balance correctly as soon as we start moving back. But yeah, more and more events are not going to be set up to handle remote speakers, non-remote speakers. I mean, there's a whole other conversation around whether or not you should have remote speakers, right? Because like, if I'm giving a remote talk to somewhere in San Francisco, A, I'm completely out of their time zone. B, I have my own life at home. I have my family, etc., etc. And so I'm going to give my talk, and then I'm probably going to disappear, right? I'm not gonna attend any virtual like drinks gatherings or something, because I'm completely out of time zone and everything. And so where's the benefit to the in-person crowd? How do you give them value for their money that they've spent getting to San Francisco, right? Sure. So it is an incredibly complex industry now, doing events and doing them well.
Yeah, absolutely. It is. It's definitely complex. It's going to be interesting to see how the next couple of years shake out, and for people like you and I to participate in building out some of those options to hopefully help improve it. Well,
we'll probably see more and more, like going back to Broadcaster very, very quickly, like we support SRT in, and we support WIP in, as well as just general WebRTC within the platform. What I'm really quite interested in is what is that next technology that we're going to accept in to make ingress, egress, etc. easier for everyone. What is that next thing that's going to kind of make all of this a bit easier? I don't have an answer to that right now. It'll be an interesting thing over the next year.
Absolutely. All right. Well, we are running short on time, but there are a couple of quick questions I want to get to, and then we'll wrap up right after that. So Jose asks, are web codecs supported by most common browsers? I know Chrome is. What about Safari and Mozilla?
As far as I am aware, I might be wrong, but I'm 99% certain I'm not. Chrome is the only browser today that supports web codecs. I think there are some early signs of movement in Safari and in Firefox, potentially. I've seen conversations happening, but as far as I'm aware, the only browser that actually allows you to use an API in a browser is still Chrome.
Okay. Thank you, Jose, for the question. And one more from Juan, who says, "Hi, Dan, I'm a beginner with WebRTC. What sort of advice would you give me to start doing broadcasting with WebRTC for the first time?"
Oh, that's quite a challenging question. What do you advise me to try or start trying if I want to do broadcasting with WebRTC? Check out the Pion examples. I keep going back to Pion, but Sean has created a wonderful community around Pion. And if you haven't read it yet, there's a book that Sean wrote along with a couple of other people now called WebRTC for the Curious. I think WebRTC4thecurious.com, I think.
Yep, I believe that's right.
And so go read that and then take a look at Pion, all the Pion examples. Especially when it comes to broadcast, like figuring out how you can kind of interact like these typical broadcast technologies like SRT, we're talking about wrist in the future and stuff like that. Then all of this is gonna, you want everything to coexist, right? And so the Pion examples are probably pretty good for that kind of stuff. It's one of those things that we do not do well as a community, like as a WebRTC community. Getting started with WebRTC is actually really, really, really difficult because there's so much to it. To get it right, there's so much to it. And so, yeah, I think all of the Pion examples come with like really basic web pages that do one thing very, very, very well. And so that's probably a good place to start.
Yeah. I agree completely. All right, Dan, where can our viewers learn more about you and learn more about Broadcaster?
So I'm Dan_Jenkins on Twitter for however long
Twitter for a little while
remains to exist. I'm Dan Jenkins on the Fostodon Mastodon server. But yeah, find me on Twitter and I've got links to all of my other places on Twitter, Dan_Jenkins. And then, if you're interested in Broadcaster, broadcaster.vc. And if you're interested in WebRTC consulting, because you want someone that knows what they're doing with lots of device types and different browser tricks or whatever, and you don't want to go to Arin's team, then you can go to nimblea.pe or just Google Nimble Ape. And I'll be there.
Sounds good. Or call us both. We'll work together.
Yes, absolutely.
Excellent. All right. Well, thanks again for joining us today, Dan. Always a pleasure to speak with you. And as always, this video will be available on the WebRTC Ventures YouTube channel, as well as on our blog at WebRTC Ventures. Thanks so much, Dan.
Thank you very much.
And our next episode will be December 14th. Our guest will be our own Alberto Gonzalez from WebRTC Ventures. To find out more about our upcoming episodes, follow us on Twitter at WebRTC Ventures, on Twitch, LinkedIn, YouTube, or join our email list at WebRTC Ventures. Thanks for joining us today. Let's make it live.
Thanks for joining us for WebRTC Live. Visit our website at WebRTC.ventures to learn more about our custom design and development services and to learn more about upcoming episodes of WebRTC Live.